From the Boston Tea Party to the Civil Rights Movement, some of the coolest shit this country's done has happened because people caused a ruckus and pissed off someone in charge. Here's why nonviolent protests are awesome, and you should stop complaining about them.
I don't know what protests you're referring to, but most of the protests I've been complaining about are not nonviolent. Ferguson, Charlotte, and Milwaukee are all examples of violent responses to 3 justified shootings, 2 of which were done by black officers, yet the riot in Milwaukee led to this little event.
Hey, they beating up every white person! They jumping every white person!
Most of the protests cucks like you defend are about as non-violent as a train hitting a truck.
December 16th, 1773. The Sons of Liberty dump tea into the Boston Harbor at midnight.
What a bunch of thugs!
Oh, sorry, I thought you were trying to be funny for a second there.
At the time, most Americans were horrified by the protest. George Washington wrote that he did not approve their conduct in destroying the tea, but John Adams described the protests as so bold, so daring, so firm.
Honestly, I can sympathize with people disagreeing with the protests, because while they weren't violent, they were still destroying property. On top of that, this led to the British shutting down Boston Harbor and passing what are known today as the Intolerable Acts. And even disregarding that, this is a false equivalency. Based on that "what a bunch of thugs" line, I assume you're trying to equate this to the BLM riots. Again, these riots weren't peaceful. And unlike the Boston Tea Party, which only destroyed property of the people they were protesting against, these riots caused massive amounts of damage to the rioters' own communities. Not only that, but like I established earlier, people were even targeted and assaulted because of their skin color. Had this been a riot started by white people who went out and assaulted black people, any movement related to it would be immediately disparaged.
1912 to 1920. Women demand an equal vote.
Well, I don't know how they could disrespect the president like that. It's just not patriotic.
Oh wait, it's still not funny.
While the push for women's suffrage dates back to the 1800s, members of the U.S. National Women's Party staged marches and started picketing in front of the White House in the early 1900s. By the time World War I started in 1917, the American public got angry at the suffragettes. People felt the protests were disrespectful. Opposition to the protesters got violent, and police wanted to put a stop to them in the interest of public safety.
No, to be fair, the Women's March on Trump's inauguration day was pretty peaceful from what I've seen. There were some riots breaking out that day, obviously, but in most of the footage I've seen, I haven't noticed any of them wearing one of those ugly pink hats. So it's likely that those rioters were separate from the actual march.
So as we all know, the women gave up and still don't have the right to vote. Oh wait!
Ooh, you sure got me now. Except for one tiny error. Like you said, the suffragettes actually had something to gain from protesting. While I can appreciate the peacefulness of the movement, that doesn't automatically make it a worthy cause. The Westboro Baptist Church's protests are usually fairly peaceful, but that doesn't mean I have to respect them or what they stand for. And in the case of the Women's March, they were pretty much protesting for rights they already have. Try again.
1954 to 1968. Black Americans demand equal treatment in the eyes of the law.
Why are they making such a big deal over a bathroom?
Okay, first of all, there's a difference between gender-segregated bathrooms and racial-segregated bathrooms. The entire point of racially segregated bathrooms was so they could purposefully refuse to clean them as a middle finger to black Americans. Secondly, the civil rights movement wasn't just for desegregating bathrooms, it was about making sure that black people were considered equal in the eyes of the law.
Despite the abolition of slavery, black citizens still faced violence and discrimination under U.S. law.
Yes, exactly. Do you even need me here? You seem to be doing a pretty good job of debunking yourself.
People today consider the civil rights movement of the 60s a largely peaceful protest, and we all know white people love quoting MLK.
Well, if white people quoting MLK is such a problem to you, then I hope you're prepared to never mention him again.
Back then, Not so much. In 1964, 63% of Americans said civil rights leaders pushed too fast. 57% of them said civil rights protesters were violent, and 58% said civil rights activists hurt their own cause.
But we know that MLK's protests weren't violent because he preached non-violence.
But surely we have had a fair amount of violence this year already.
Yes, I would say that this violence is, as I've said before, been unfortunate. I do not approve of violence, whether it is perpetrated by racists or whether it's perpetrated by Negroes. I think it's both impractical and immoral in our struggle. But I think it is important to see and to say that the violence which emerged in the few cities, that I think 5 or 6 that we've had it in, came mainly from a very small group.
If you check blacklivesmatter.com, you'll find little to no mention of peace or non-violence. And during an interview with Alicia Garza by Complex, she even makes excuses for the violence that erupted in Charlotte. I have one simple question to ask of BLM. If Martin Luther King could hold non-violent protests even when they knew they were going to be hosed and beaten by the police during a time when there were laws that specifically stated that black people were to be treated differently than whites, then why must your movement resort to violence on such a grand scale when things are objectively better for black Americans than they ever were in MLK's time? I understand that every group has its radical outliers, but if the leaders of the movement know what they're doing, they'll make sure to discourage such actions, not make excuses for them.
And yes, it's on protesters and organizers and community leaders to discourage violence at all times.
But nothing. The leaders of BLM have not made any effort to discourage violence, and until they do, they will continue to be called out on it. Otherwise, we're just enabling this kind of behavior. In conclusion, you have failed to explain how modern-day SJWs match up in any way to civil rights movements of the past. The only protest in recent memory that could be considered peaceful at all would be the Women's March, and even that amounted to nothing more than a waste of time. Just because you protest something, that doesn't automatically make you right, and I get the feeling that you would not defend these protests if they were in response to something like refugees entering the US. And that's everything I have to say. Thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoyed the video.